Welcome, everybody. Welcome to our audience. Welcome to our panelists. This is actually a pre-recorded panel discussion for the 2020 Bank Street Book Fest. So exciting. We're all in different locations. Later on, if we have time, we'll tell everybody where we are. The title for today's panel is All American or Forever Foreigner, the Uneasy Balancing Act of Asian American Voices from the Pacific Rim. Asian American as an idea was actually invented in the 1960s to bring together immigrants from several East Asian countries, mostly for strategic and political purposes. Now, in the early 21st century, many of us know that the term Asian American represents highly diverse cultures, histories, and immigrant experiences. BookFest is so excited to have this diverse group of authors with us, with heritages rooted in East and Southeast Asia today. And I'm honored to serve as your moderator. I'm Roxanne Hsu Feldman, originally from Taiwan. My parents actually came from mainland China in 1949 when the Communist Party took power and drove the Democratic Party out of mainland China. Growing up, my school history textbooks focused mostly on glorifying the ancient Chinese history, really emphasizing on the revolution that overthrew the dynasty, and very little about indigenous Taiwanese and early settlers by the Democratic Party, the oppression. It's not until I was an adult that I understood some of that history. As a young person, I never really understood our culture by books that's not textbook, history textbook. So I'm really excited that now in the United States, we have so many Asian American authors who are providing information, history, identities, representations that are not in some, you know, predetermined historical textbook. So I'm so excited that our children have the opportunity to read all your books. So with that, I want to turn over to each person and each author to introduce yourselves. Okay, we're going to start by inviting Robin. Can you talk a
Hello.
little bit about yourself and your book?
Sure. Hi, my name is Robin Ha. I'm a Korean American cartoonist living in Washington, D.C. I am the author of Almost American Girl, which is a graphic novel memoir that came out in January this year. And I'm also the author of best-selling Korean cookbook with recipes. Yeah, so my book, Almost American Girl, is about my first few years in America trying to find a new home and, struggling with language barrier. And it's really, I feel very lucky that I can actually be able to tell my story and somehow represent this big void that I found in graphic novel genre. And yeah, I mean, this is really has been a pretty traumatic year for everyone, but I think especially for Asian Americans. So I am very glad that I can actually be here and talk about all the things that we're going to talk about today.
Great, thank you. Min?
Hello. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to see my face amongst all of these other amazing faces and authors. My name is Minh Le. I'm a Vietnamese American author. I was born in Connecticut, but my family's originally from Vietnam. I'm probably known mostly as a picture book author, but today I'll be talking about Green Lantern Legacy, which is my first middle grade graphic novel, and I'll tell you briefly. It's about a 13-year-old Vietnamese American boy who lives with his parents and his grandmother. And unfortunately, one day his grandmother passes away, and he ends up with her jade ring, or what he thought was her jade ring, because it turns out that it was actually a Green Lantern power ring, and that his grandmother had been a Green Lantern, had been a superhero his entire life, and he didn't know it. So then the story follows him as he learns about his grandmother's secret superhero past, while also learning how to become a superhero himself. And it was really powerful for me to have the opportunity to write for DC Comics and to write something that felt very personal and took some of the inspiration from people in my family community and put it on the page in a way that hopefully will resonate with readers like myself, but also readers who are from different backgrounds. So I'm excited to talk about it today and to hear from everyone else.
Thank you so much. Cynthia, or Cindy, as we have come to know her.
Hi, my name is Cynthia Kadohata. I'm the author of A Place to Belong, and I have a new book, Saucy, about a little factory farm pig. But this is a book I'll be talking about today. And so I was born in Chicago, and we moved when I was quite young to Georgia and later to Arkansas. And my sister has always said that we were second-class citizens in Arkansas, and she's older than me, so she had a more, I think, acute experience of feeling like we were second class, but I never really felt that way. I almost felt that being in certain ways ignored gave us a type of freedom to live almost this kind of magical life underneath maybe the awareness of a lot of other people's lives, if that makes sense. I loved living in a small town, and I'm really looking forward to talking to these amazing authors and illustrators.
Great, thank you so much. Christina.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Christina Soontornvat, and I'm calling in from Austin, Texas. So it's so interesting to hear Cindy say she grew up in a small town in Arkansas. I didn't know that, and I grew up in a small town in Texas. So I can't wait to talk to you more about all of this. I'm Thai American. My father is a Thai immigrant, and I was born in Texas, and I'm very lucky. I have 2 books that are set in Thailand that are out this year. So A Wish in the Dark is a middle grade fantasy novel. It's a twist on Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, and it's set in a magical Thai inspired world. And then coming out, my newest book that's coming out is All 13. So this is a nonfiction account of the Thai cave rescue that took place 2 years ago. So I traveled back to Thailand to interview the rescuers and the boys and take pictures, and I'm just really honored and excited for that book that's coming out. And I'm just so excited to be with all of you. Actually, this week I had my kids were reading 2 of your books that are on this panel, and I didn't even plant them. Like, I didn't push them to do that. They just picked them up and were so engrossed in reading them. So this is very cool.
Thank you so much. I've been reading everybody's book, and some I was reading. Just love everything. Thank you all so much for offering that. Abigail.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to have this conversation. I'm also from a small town. I grew up in Solon, Ohio, outside the Cleveland area. And I currently live in the Bay Area with my husband and 2 boys. But right now, at this moment, I'm actually calling in from Taiwan, where I'm here to do research for my second book. So my first book is Loveboat Taipei. It came out in January, and it follows a girl named Ever Wong, whose strict parents send her to Taiwan, kicking and screaming to learn language and culture. And it's actually a story of identity, of her trying to discover who she is. What does it mean for her to pursue her dreams of dancing while still honoring her parents who want her to go to med school?
Thank you so much. I actually didn't quite know about Loveboat Taipei, and it's really fun to read about it. Kalia.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kao Kalia Yang. I go by Kalia. I'm coming to you from St. Paul, Minnesota. I have an office, but my office door, the lock doesn't work, and I have 3 little ones. So in case we get a surprise visit, it's from them. I don't have the heart to change the lock anymore, but I've written for adults. Just this past year, I started writing for children. It is an incredible world that I've always been a part of, but now I can be a part of as a writer. A year ago, this book came out, A Map into the World, my first children's book. And then in this pandemic, in June, The Shared Room came out, introducing one of the first Hmong American illustrators to Literary America. And then just today, I had a launch event for my newest book, The Most Beautiful Thing. So I've been busy at it, contributing to these shells that I love. And I'm delighted to be a part of this panel and be in conversation with all of you.
Thank you so much. I can't wait to delve in. So we're going to start with our first question. Um, as everybody can see, if you're attending this at BookFest or watching this book on video on demand, you realize that all these books have such different topics, different content, but I think they all have something in common. They are all actually rarely or never addressed in previous books for children. Um, so I'm really curious about what inspired and motivated you to write this particular title or two particular titles, because some of you have two or three books that you want to talk about. What are the specific cultural practices or philosophies that you wanted to highlight in your book? So can we start by inviting Christina?
Yes, when I was growing up, the only time I ever saw Thai culture in media was when I watched not Anna and the King, The King and I. So I remember seeing the musical The King and I, and that was the only time I saw Thai language and customs, and if you know the musical, if you know the play, you know that there's just a lot of stereotypes, and Thai people are not a huge fan of this play. But I remember as a kid having this weird mixed feeling of being proud and excited to see my culture like on television on AMC Classic. And that was often like the only time other people, like the white people that I grew up with, knew anything about Thai culture was from that movie, from that film. So it was, exhilarating, but then also the sense of shame of like just how much they got wrong and how much they left out. So my books, the first one to come out, this is the first book that I wrote that I incorporated anything from my Thai heritage into. My first books that I wrote is a series, fantasy series also, but I was not writing about Thai characters. I think it took me a while to be able to feel like I had the confidence and the right to tell this type of story. I think I really struggled with feeling like I was Thai enough to tell this type of story and to set a novel in this world. A Wish in the Dark is really heavily influenced by stories that my father told me when I was a kid. And I just had to get over it. I don't think I'm over it, actually. We can go into like a therapy session later to see if I'm over it, of being Thai enough, of having the permission to write a story like this. But I think when I thought about myself as a young person and the fact that this is one of the only Thai American novels out there, I thought, I have to do that. I have to try to put that book on the shelf for other people.
Love how when you mentioned legitimacy, everyone started nodding along.
Yes. Minh, since you jumped in, do you want to talk about the inspiration for Green Lantern?
Yeah, sure. Like I said, I was invited by DC Comics to pitch them a story for this new line of graphic novels for young readers. And when I was looking at all the characters, I was trying to figure out, find an entry point to write something that felt like it resonated with me. And so when I saw Green Lantern and how it's a character that's someone has a strong willpower and they have this green ring, I had this like flash. Actually, I have a picture of I had this picture of my own grandmother, who always wore a jade ring and is like one of the strongest people that I know. So like she was very much like a true life hero to me and my family, and is very much responsible for getting much of my family out of Vietnam during the war. So for me, it was a combination of one, trying to focus on bringing to the page the real heroes that walk among us and try to present that in a way that's fun for kids through the superhero elements. But then also, like Christina, I didn't see much of Vietnamese culture on the shelves when I was growing up. If it's in comic books or stories, they're mostly sidekicks or stereotypes. And then the other thing is that if you go into a bookstore or a library, there'll be a big section on Vietnam, but it's all about the war and all written from a US perspective. So it's like I was used to seeing Vietnam only in the context of like Vietnam and Vietnamese people as like the backdrop to American trauma. So to be able to take our own stories and center ourselves in it meant something to me. And like Christina, I dealt with the same things, like all the gray hairs that you see up here are like those same like legitimacy questions up late at night, being like, am I doing this right? Is this detail just right? Am I the right person to tell this story? And I think that's something that we all grapple with. And I think the fact that we're grappling with it is part of, or at least the way I've justified it, is the fact that we're asking these questions is part of the reason why we're the people to tell these stories, because we know that there's a responsibility there. We know that we take it very seriously, and we're always going to have those doubts, but those doubts fuel the drive for authenticity. And so that, at least that's my hope. But I'll pass it on now.
Yeah, anybody wants to take on inspiration? Yeah.
I think that,
Yeah.
you know, Christina, you mentioned The King and I. I was born in Thailand, but I was born in a refugee camp in Thailand. So I never saw the rest of Thailand. But when I saw that movie for the first time, all of a sudden I felt this kinship, you know, with America movie and everything at large. And it was an interesting kinship. It was a lonely kinship. Minh, when you talk about the Vietnam War and how Vietnamese were described as a backdrop to everything American, you know, the Hmong were in the secret war in Laos, and that's how we became refugees. But of course, whenever we did American history, there was always only the mention of the Vietnamese and the Americans.
Mm-hmm.
Hmong was completely deleted from those books. So growing up, I had this interesting and I think deep loneliness to be connected to a bigger world, connected to a documented history. I come from a people that is strong in the oral tradition, but we were devoid of a written language a long time ago. And so it wasn't until the 1950s that a French missionary devised a Roman alphabet for the Hmong language. Growing up, I grew up first with the stories of my elders. The oral tradition is really where I draw my inspiration from. And I think this hunger to put the books on the shelves is very much my own hunger. A St. Paul librarian who's not yet that old remembers me going to this bookmobile with my sister in the McDonough Housing Project. And I'm asking her very quietly if there are books about people like me on those shelves. And she looks at me and she goes to those shelves and she found a book about the Chinese, one about the Vietnamese, and she came back and she said, I'm so sorry, sweetheart, there are no books about your people on these shelves. And she says, and I remember saying underneath my breath, one day a little girl is going to come in here and she's going to find a book about the people who love her best. And I left that bookmobile behind that day, but I returned numerous other times to read books about a bigger world, to see how and where those stories were situated. But I'll end with this tiny little story. So I got my library card and I told my grandmother that I got this library card and it was the best thing in the world because now I could access all the stories of the world. And my grandma listened to me and then she said, are there stories like mine? 39 years old. I have yet to find the stories like my grandmother's. And that's part of my inspiration for doing the work that I do.
Thank you so much. You kind of, I'm actually tearing up. So if my voice catches, that's because I'm so moved by everybody's sharing right now. Robin, do you feel compelled to say something? Any other
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I have similar approach as Minh. Like when I started as a freelance cartoonist, I used to draw superhero comics, and I mean I didn't really grow up here, so I didn't read superhero comics as a kid, so I didn't really have that connection to superhero genre in whatever Marvel, DC, doesn't matter, so I was really trying to find a story that I can really connect with. So I was reading all kinds of independent comics that's coming out. And one book that really stuck with me was American Born Chinese. And I was like, wow, this is actually really something close to my experience being an Asian American. And I was like, there should be more books like this out there. And in the beginning of 2000, there has been a lot of great memoir graphic novel that came out, but none of them was about Asian Americans. So I just saw a giant big gaping hole there. And whenever, I'm at a cocktail party meeting new people, of course, they're going to ask me like, where are you from? Then I'll tell them about my story. And so like Almost American Girl is about, when I was 14, my mom took me to Alabama, telling me this is a vacation. And then when she got there, she married her boyfriend and we never went back. So I was thrown into 8th grade without speaking any English, and that school didn't have ESL. So I'll tell people about this experience, and like, it will be very, American people will be like shocked. They were like, oh my God, I can't believe your mom did that. But then I know so many Asian Americans who have like very similar immigrant experience. Their parents just like took them one day and say like, you're going to America. You don't get to say yes or no, you know? So I just thought that, this is something that I share with a whole bunch of Asian American immigrants, yet it's never been told in American publishing. So that's one of my biggest reasons that I started working on this book.
Thank you so much for sharing. Cynthia, I'm actually specifically thinking about A Place to Belong. That is also very rarely told in children's books in America. So can you talk a little bit about that, and then Abigail?
So I've had the same boyfriend for a long time. We lived together with my son and our son. And his dad he renounced his citizenship after World War II ended. And he didn't actually expect to get shipped to Japan, but he says, we were told, you're going to Japan. And so he and his younger siblings and his mom and dad were all shipped to Japan. And they used to just be flower farmers, and they were just basic, kind of hardworking, honest people. And he said when he was there, his dad just kind of broke down and wasn't able to provide for his family. So he was 21 and he took over the family, and he would lie and steal and do whatever he could to feed them. And then he says when he came back home, he opened an azalea nursery and went back to his life of just hard work and honesty, really. And so when he died, he died in his kitchen in Cudahy, California, and his breathing was very labored. And I just thought of that scene in Blade Runner where, the replicant is about to die and he reaches out to save the life of the man who has been trying to kill him. And he said, he just talks about all the things that he's seen in his life, all the amazing things around the universe that he's seen. And he just said, all these things are going to be lost now because I'm dying. And so I just wanted to make sure that this man's life was not lost.
Thank you so much for sharing. No, it's good. It's good. Real emotions. Thank you so much. And yeah, and I have to say, like, the book definitely conveys such a precious memory and culture references. So thank you for that. And Abigail, inspiration for Loveboat, I think. And
so
your new book too.
Right, I'm so grateful for all the thoughts here. I definitely relate to all of that. I grew up. I loved Laura Ingalls books when I was growing up. I never thought I could be a writer like her. I wanted to be a part of the Ingalls family. I think they had so much wisdom and so much love for each other. But there was a part of me that always knew if I dropped into Laura's world, that her mother wouldn't like me. Her mother was racist against Native Americans, and I think Laura was open-minded enough that she would have been curious about me. But I felt like I knew that she probably would have asked certain questions about me, in a way that sometimes I would get in Ohio, that would make me feel like someone doesn't belong here. So Loveboat Taipei was inspired by an actual program that's been around since the 1960s. I was actually really interested to hear you say that that's when the term Asian American was coined as well. But the Taiwanese government would invite everyone with a Chinese last name to this program in Taiwan. So thousands of kids have gone on this program to learn Chinese language and culture over the years. And I had attended the program myself. I was a presidential scholar in high school, and even though my parents are not from Taiwan, my parents are actually from the Philippines and Indonesia. It was for me an opportunity to really connect with my parents' culture in a way that I'd never had before. So, and also connect with my parents' culture as myself and not necessarily through their eyes. And so that's really what Loveboat Taipei is about. I mean, I felt like it was this very strange experience in the Asian American community that very few people knew about outside of it. But basically the kids go for the summer. It's like a bunch of 18, 19, 20-year-olds dropped off by themselves in a foreign country, and there's no supervision. So the kids end up going crazy all summer. There's a lot of sneaking out to go dancing and clubbing and drinking snake blood sake, and then touring the night markets, going on a tour around the whole island. And then there's a talent show at the end. And I think what is so striking to me about that experience was it actually showcased a side of Asian Americans that I don't think we see at all in popular media, which is like Asian Americans having fun and going clubbing and you know, and just like all the drama of romance and falling in love and making stupid mistakes and then getting back on their feet and you know, doing better. And I really wanted to showcase like the roundedness of the community. I have a cast of over 30 different characters, and that diversity is really important to me too. Like even just this panel alone, we're all Asian American authors, but we have such really rich, incredible, diverse experiences. And this is just a small sampling of the, you know, the rest of the community. And I wanted to show that. I wanted to show the humanity of the Asian Americans. And I also, for me, wanted to explore what does it mean to be someone who's between cultures. And so for my character Ever, who's from Ohio, you know, she's initially trying to run away from being Asian. She doesn't want to be Asian. But when she goes to Taiwan on this trip, she finds out, okay, this is a big part of who I am as well. And she's able to integrate that world, those two halves of herself into something that's just uniquely her.
Thank you all so much for sharing. So I actually, my second question is changed a little bit, especially inspired by the idea of whether you are Vietnamese American enough or Vietnamese enough or, you know, Thai enough or Japanese enough to tell a particular story. So as you were writing your story, gathering information, everybody does research, if you find out anything that deepens your own identity as you go along when you were doing your research, or something that's surprising. So I'm just curious about, is there anything that you found that you would like to say in the future? I'm trying to get, can Minh jump in for this one, just because you actually follow up on that one? Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I don't think it was so much like a factual thing that I discovered through the process, but for me it was more like just a psychological reckoning, because in my mind, that question of legitimacy, I was always holding myself and my life experience to this imaginary standard of what a quote unquote pure Vietnamese American experience would be, or like what that legitimate authentic experience was. And for me, it was kind of like finally, sadly at the age of 40, coming to terms with the fact that like there is such a wide breadth of experience, and that my experience as a Vietnamese American is as legitimate as anyone else's experience as a Vietnamese American, right? And I think that took a long time to come to, because I grew up in suburban Connecticut. There was like, I always joke that all the Vietnamese people in our town could fit into one minivan, and it belonged to my uncle, right? It's like there weren't that many people around. So it's like, in my mind, I was in a significant way cut off from my own culture and like experience. But it was rich in a lot of ways. And like I'm very close to my family. We went to, my grandparents started Buddhist temple. We all have different shades and variations of experience. And because the Asian American experience, as Abigail was saying, is so broad, and it is so diverse in itself, that there is no one gold standard to deviate from. I feel like we're all variations on, and all legitimate flavors of this experience. And I think that realization helped me kind of understand that I can only write as authentic as I know how. And if some of the details are different than someone else's experience, that doesn't make it any less true, right? So for me, like I said, it wasn't like I wish I could find like a magic footnote in a textbook somewhere that would say, you know, Minh Le, you are legitimate. But I didn't find that, but I came to it another way.
Yeah, thank you. Anybody else?
Well, I think I have the flip experience. I have a face that fits in all of Asia, not just Southeast Asia. You know, outside of Minnesota and California, when I say Hmong, nobody knew what Hmong was. People would suggest Mongolia. You know, when I was just a little one, instead of trying to explain this thing that I didn't understand, that I couldn't locate in the books, I would say the truth. My cousin's name is Bruce Lee and his son is Brandon Lee. And everybody immediately laughed. And then the answer was enough. But the reality is that part of being the work of a writer and doing the kind of writing I do is that oftentimes I'm people's first introduction to Hmongness. And it is an interesting thing to belong to a people spread across the world, a people without a country. I grew up in a shamanist home. Every dollar, every coin I spend says, "In God we trust." So there's always been this kind of brand of quiet amongness, which is to say that whenever I go places, I think people come to hear me, not to hear about my books or my stories. They come to hear me because if they know Hmong, they're interested in what Hmong is, which is always interesting when they say to me. And the number one comment I get everywhere I go is, "You're not what we expected." Because people's expectations, I think, oftentimes limit my reach as a writer, my reach as a storyteller, which is the heart of the books that I write. I don't want to deliver what is expected. You know, I'm not writing in search of what is expected. I'm writing to discover the unknown, to show myself and the world around me what it is that Hmongness can be, what it is that human beings can do when we seek to write literature, which is to say, I'm not a journalist. I'm not writing for a day, you know. I'm writing literature because I'm hoping to write for all of time.
Yeah, I would add to that, writing Loveboat Taipei has been one of the most growing experiences for me. I did not know that an Asian American girl could be the main character of a novel for many, many years. And it wasn't until I did my MFA program at Vermont College of Fine Arts where the We Need Diverse Books movement grew out of, in part, that I was really encouraged to go write your Asian American main character. And then here I have a book of 30 Asian American characters. And that for me has been a really growing experience to see there is so much to bring to the table. There's so much richness in our heritage, even going through the immigrant experience. That's that kind of person who leaves their country and is able to set roots down somewhere else, is someone who takes risks. And then my characters who go back to Asia for this experience, and then they had the Summer of Rebellion. What I learned from that is that actually taught them leadership skills that are so important in the United States. I work in Silicon Valley where we're always looking for disruptive leaders who are willing to challenge the status quo and turn the industries upside down. And I think sometimes in Asian American culture, that's, especially for newer immigrants, sometimes we don't feel comfortable with that. And I think those skills that we learned on this program of resisting the system ended up being really important to that growth. So I think all of this has affirmed for me the good things in our experience and our culture. And then, when Loveboat Taipei hit the New York Times list and it was picked up by Barnes & Noble as a young adult book club pick, and then it was optioned for film in Hollywood, all these things to me, again, were affirming, yes, our stories are important. These stories have things to say, not just to people within our community, but people outside our community. And I'm so encouraged, and I'm so encouraged by this panel as well.
Yeah, talking about people outside the community, that was one thing I've learned since A Wish in the Dark has come out. I had this real anxiety about how well white kids would relate to the book. I think I just still carried this, not trauma, but an insecurity from my childhood where I felt like a story that was centered on Thai characters, and there are no characters in the book at all who aren't Thai, that kids would be able to relate to it from other cultures. I knew that Asian American kids would be interested in the book, and I wanted to create something for them. So I think since having had that book come out and having conversations with kids, mostly all through Zoom, all of my school visits are now are all virtual. That's been so, it just strikes me how every time I talk to them, I'm always a little bit surprised and delighted. And I shouldn't be surprised because, of course, kids are perfect. They can relate to anyone. And, looking back on when we were children, Abigail related to the Little House on the Prairie books. I mean, how many books did we relate to where we had no people who looked like us or were like us at all? But I just find myself being a little bit surprised and remind myself like, oh, that is this thing that I carry from my experience of not ever seeing myself on the page, that I hope I'm getting over as an author, but that's been something to learn and to kind of grapple with as an author.
And not to jump out of turn, but I wanted to point out like something that you and Abigail mentioned. When all the characters in a book are Asian or Asian American, it's like that's when the nuance happens, right? Because it's like then the hero is Asian, the villain is Asian, the sidekick is Asian, the best friend. It's like all those different nuanced roles get to be filled, and then they're not just falling into like these categories where it's like if there's a movie where there's one Asian character, they fill that like particular role. I remember watching like I think it was in translation, but like these like old school kung fu dramas that my parents would have on VHS. And I was like, everyone is Asian, so it's like all the different roles are different shades of characters, which I found really refreshing.
Yeah.
Cynthia?
Yes, I was just thinking when I was growing up, and I agree that we can all relate to anything. Like I know with Kira, I had a librarian tell me she has a group of girls and they just like to read books that make them cry. They don't want to read any books unless it's going to make them cry. And so she didn't give it to them specifically because it's about this Japanese American girl's experience. She gave it to them because she thought it would make them cry, which I think is fine. Like I'm actually fine with whatever kids get out of any book that I write. But I also think, I just remember back when I was little and we didn't have a lot of money. And so we didn't really own books. But my sister had this book, Japanese fairy tales, and it had these beautiful illustrations. I was just incredibly jealous of that book. And when I grew up, I actually saw that book on eBay. I was always looking for it and I found it and I bought it. It was just so exciting to unwrap that book. And there was another book. It was a reader that I had in second grade, and it had that book that had that story that I think a lot of people, don't really like today. The Five Chinese Brothers, I think it was called. And I don't remember it at all, but I remember that I wanted to keep that book so passionately, and it was part of a reader with many stories. I sobbed and sobbed, and I told my mom I was not going to give this book back, and she kept saying it belongs to the school. I said, I'm not giving it back. I was hysterical. And so she typed the story up for me, and of course she wasn't that good of a typist, and said there are all these mistakes, and she handed it to me, which was really sweet, but I kind of looked at it like, okay. And anyway, later I remember when I was older, I saw that book in our house and I thought, oh, my mom never gave that book back. She held on to it for me, even though it belonged to the school. But so I think that it is important as well just to have a lot of representation out there so kids can look and see, oh, there's someone like me in this book. Because it just means so much to you when you're a kid.
It really does. Yeah, Stacey Lee actually is a longtime critique partner of mine. She writes Asian American historical novels, and she told us a similar story about about the Five Chinese Brothers. She said she wrote her name in the library copy because she wanted for that to be her book.
I think that was one of the only times, the only elementary books in our school library that had Asian characters, which is like, oh,
I know.
Not the best one, right?
No, and they all looked identical to each other.
That's like the point of the book is no one can tell them apart.
That's all we had.
Robin, do you want to say something before I move on to the next question?
Sure. I think all the pressure, anxiety that we're feeling is because like there's still just not that many books about an Asian American out there that we feel that pressure to represent correctly. Like if there's like tons of books out there that talks about all different type of people who look like us, we're not gonna feel like, oh, we have to represent our kind, So hopefully in the future we wouldn't have to feel this much pressure. And also, I think culturally, I was born in Korea, so like a lot of my foundational psychology was built in Korea, and in Asian culture, like we're taught to not really stand out, like, kind of keep your voice down, like, in America, they say squeaky wheel gets oiled. In Asia, they say if your nail sticks out, it gets hammered. So, it's a completely different approach to having your own voice. So like I grew up thinking like talking about myself too much is a bad thing, and talking about like thinking that I am worthy of representing all these other people is a wrong thing, So I think I'm still kind of battling that and kind of trying to overcome that, because somebody needs to tell the stories, whether it's me or somebody else, And I think having that kind of responsibility is a good thing, like it will make us grow into a better writer than just say like whatever I say is truth and nobody can tell me it's not,
Yeah, thank you so much. I think listening to all of you, I'm actually jumping to our question. That's our title, right? I heard somebody, I think Kalia somebody say, you're not what I expected. And Minh and other people say, like, we have a wide variety of experiences. But from the outside, people always think, in some ways, Asian Americans have a particular stereotypical way of presenting ourselves. So as you write, how do you balance drawing from the lived experiences and the generally held stereotypes, even though some of the stereotypes are so rooted in reality? Straight A students, family expectations of becoming doctors, and being obedient, being conforming, being not speaking out. How do you balance your characters so don't maybe they don't just fit into a stereotype? And also, um, how do you hold the idea of Asians versus Asian Americans, the lines? How do you hold and balance? Does anybody want to just jump in, or do I have to call on somebody?
I can jump in on this one because it's something I had to think a lot about with 30 different characters. And so maybe in some ways that was my answer, is having 30 different characters and they're all different. And so I was able to showcase, Asians who were quiet, and Asians who were obnoxious, Asians who were smart and were going to great schools, and some who couldn't even read. And I think being able to showcase again that diversity within the community was helpful. Where some of the characters do fit stereotypes, like so Ever's parents are in some ways stereotypically wanting her to go to med school, but there is some basis in history in that, and part of that is in, for example, in parts of Asia and in Taiwan, like sometimes being a doctor was the only way up for certain people during occupation by other powers. And at the same time, though, her mother, who wants her to be a doctor, also volunteers with the church's homeless shelter, right? And so that there are other details around each of the people that helps to round them out as a character entirely. And then I also had to explore the concept of Asian versus Asian American, because my book is set in Taiwan. And so there's 30 different Asian American characters, but they're also interacting with the Asian staff, who, in some ways the Asian American characters kind of have some stereotypes going in about what their Asian staff are going to be like and how strict the dragon, who's the head of the program, is going to be like. But what she finds instead is, she's able to connect pretty deeply with one of the Asian girls on staff, who turns out to be an Aboriginal girl from one of the tribes. And she realizes, she connects with her in a special way because they are both minorities in their, in the places that they're growing up. And then in the end, there's a moment for even the dragon to show that she's actually quite open-minded, maybe even more open-minded than Ever's family, who's in the United States, or even people that Ever grows up with. So I really enjoyed that opportunity to explore like just so many different facets, and then allowing the characters to really be themselves entirely, and showcasing like the fullness of who they are was a big part of that approach.
And growing up in Minnesota, when people say, "What are you?" the right answer is always, "I am Hmong." It's never that I'm an American. The first time that I was called an American was when I left America behind. And I went to Thailand for study abroad, and everybody would say, "What are you?" And I'd say, "I'm Hmong." And they're like, "You don't look Hmong, like not the Hmong from the hills." And then they say, "You're Japanese, you're Korean." And then when I started eating or walking, they say, "You're an American. You're too messy. You waste too much energy in your movements. You're an American." In my own life, my mom and dad, because they didn't know other possibilities, and because to be a doctor or a lawyer was so essential to the survival of the community, that's what they wanted us to be. But when I told my parents that I wanted to become a writer after my grandma died, my father looked at me. His hands would always do this when he was worried. And so I knew he was worried. And then he said, "If the sky that I live under can fall on me, If the earth that I walk on can throw me off, who am I to stand in your way? You know, in many ways, those words have shaped my life and my work as a writer. So often people will ask me, you know, "Well, how do you feel being a Hmong American writer, to be a single woman or a married woman traveling all across the country by yourself?" You know, and one time they asked in front of my dad, and in the car, he looked at me, he said, did they ask you what it was like to be my daughter? And I said, kind of. And my dad, he looked at me very seriously and he said, you know, the work you will do will go beyond your gender. It will go beyond your people. It is for a bigger humanity. I did not give birth to anyone less than that. And that's really what I do when I go on the page. Yes, I know the stereotypes. I don't care for them. And so I go in with everything that I am and I infuse it with that, trusting that the truth of the stories will rise up and that they will stand on their own. And I think, you know, I've been at this since I was 22. I'm 39, so it's a long time. Um, every year that becomes more and more true. I grow more stubbornly myself and more defiantly um, stereotypical. And I like that. And I want my characters to live in a world created by such a person.
Thank you.
I totally agree with you. Like, I always thought that I was Korean until I went to Korea. And then they told me, no, you're a Korean American. You're too different from us. So it's like everyone in the world has a prejudice or stereotype about other people, you know? So when they see that, they just like name you and put you in that box saying like, you're American, you know, or you're Korean. And I think it's our job as a writer to really see what makes some people Korean or American or Korean American, you know? It's like, it's not necessarily bad or good that some character fits into that category or not. But I think it's only problematic when we're enforcing a negative stereotype on other people just based on their ethnicity, like the same way how we will like put negative stereotype on girls versus boys, or you know. So yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, you go, Christina.
I was just gonna say, in all 13, I actually got to like kind of explicitly push back on stereotypes because it's a true story. And so in part of the book, I'm kind of responding to how the Western media is interpreting events and the things that they got wrong. Because they didn't understand Thai culture. Like, for example, when the boys who had been trapped in the cave were finally found, and the rescuers, the British rescuers, remarked about how they were all smiles and they were, you know, just chipper, they were doing so great. And you know, a stereotype about Thailand, it's their tourism tagline is, it's the land of smiles. It's like an idea that everyone there is just always so eager to please or something like that. When really a smile in Thai culture doesn't necessarily mean I'm happy and I have no worries. It's like a respectful thing to do to put the other people in the room at ease, is to smile to them. So it's just things like that, and things about religion and spirituality, that it was really nice to not have to worry about, okay, how am I going to address this? How am I going to, you know, portray this in a non-stereotypical way, but just to like straight up be like, this was wrong. This is what the real truth is. So that was really nice. And just to get to, you know, explore and examine that as an American looking at Thai culture.
You know, I was just thinking of something someone said to me the other day, because I have this tendency, which is a very, I think, Japanese woman thing, where you can say something that maybe is a little serious and then you'll kind of go, or, you know, like that. And so I've had some white people say to me, why did you laugh? And I try to explain it, but it's really hard to explain. And what you just said, you know, the smiling, right? It means something different than it would mean to an American, right? And I think when people ask me, why did you do that? There's always often, let's say, a context of it's not right to do that, you know, because you're supposed to laugh at this time or this time, not at this time. And so I mean, it's really fascinating that's a really fascinating detail, because I was so fascinated by that story. I have to say, I was glued to my computer.
Oh yeah, for sure. But yeah, just all these ways that a Western perspective gets projected, and the Western judgment and values gets projected on us instead of the other way around.
And I think the fact that we can see that, like, because we sit at the intersection of multiple cultures, we are able to see that there are different ways of communicating, and that actually makes us really effective. We played a game in law school where we were all given, lawyers kind of pride themselves on being able to follow the rules, and we were all given instructions, and we weren't allowed to talk, but it was like, throwing cards, and then, if you had the highest card, if you won the seat, you're supposed to move to the next table, and if you threw a certain number, you're supposed to stay there. And so we threw one round, and everyone started pointing in the different directions, and everyone, like, it looked as though the people that you were working with didn't read the rules closely. So everyone was getting really frustrated and upset. And at the end, the teacher revealed that everyone actually had a different set of rules. And that was such an instructive moment for us all to realize, okay, this is what's happening when you're doing cross-cultural negotiations. It's not the other person's stupid or not reading closely, it's that you're operating with different rules. And I think that's something that we just live, and we know that. And it's, one of the, like, when we talk about, like what I was talking about, just feeling empowered to be myself as well, like that those are the types of things that I feel like we bring, and I want to highlight more.
Yeah, and I totally agree with what everyone's been saying. I was trying to think of what I could add, and I would say that for all of us, whether we're trying to subvert a stereotype or we're leaning into a stereotype, or whatever, we're all of our character development and writing is somehow shaped by stereotypes, right? Whether you're writing against it or towards it, and it's like, because we all live these things. From a craft perspective, I would say that there's a big difference between a character engaging in a behavior that is somewhat stereotypical, if that's true to that character. I think the danger is the opposite, where it's like the stereotype is the totality of that character, right? It's like the stereotype is all there is. I think that's what you see in a lot of like flimsily created characters, where they're like, that's as deep as they go. But I think if you're trying to create a character that's true, and one of their behaviors happens to fall into what would be a stereotype, I feel like the danger is like writing so far away from that and being afraid of that your character no longer feels authentic, right? So I think it is a tricky balance of trying to be aware of and but not necessarily being afraid of those stereotypes.
I think if you write from within, like say you're writing about these Thai soccer boys and they're all smiling, and writing from outside of that, you're making it seem like, well, why are they smiling almost, right? But if you're within that culture, then it is much more authentic. Like for instance, there was a Japanese, very older man who I was interviewing, and he was talking about being, put in a camp, and he was quite cheerful. It just wasn't that bad. It wasn't that bad. I think we overemphasized how bad it was. And he started crying. He was in his 80s. And as he was saying, it's not that bad, he was crying. And so if you almost juxtapose the fact that he feels he has to project like it wasn't that bad, or what Japanese say, shikata ganai, you just now I forget what it means. But he's projecting. You feel like you need to project this, oh, it wasn't that bad, because that's the way he was raised, to say to people outside of him wasn't that bad. But in a book, as you're writing it, you're also showing the pain underneath that. And so if the stereotype is just that he does that without showing the pain underneath that, I think that makes sense.
Yeah, it's almost like not changing or erasing the behavior, but just providing the appropriate context to understand what that behavior means.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it.
And we're coming to almost the end of our discussion. We're actually given 10 more minutes than what they were giving us, and we already used 55 minutes, so 5 more minutes. One of the things I found out about the statistics, right? According to CCBC, they track children's books publication and by authors and by representation. They say about 6% of children's books published in the past few years have Asian characters or written by Asian Americans. And that kind of aligns with the US population. About 6% of US population is Asian American. So are we done? Have we reached the pinnacle? Is that the number that we need to keep? Or are we going to multiply the numbers of Asian American representation in books?
I say we're not done. I often I think about that every time they release those statistics, because we all know that when you walk into a bookstore, you're not just seeing the books that came out that year, right? You're seeing the buildup of all of the years that came before when we were never represented. And of course, same thing in a library, many, many, many years of representation of Western white authors. And so you think about kids walking into a bookstore, kids going onto Netflix, searching around for a movie, kids going into their library, there's still not equity there. And then of course, oh my gosh, what another whole other conversation about the marketing, the publicity push, how much the pigeon driving the bus gets bought around the holidays versus like any other book. So no, we're not going to stop. We can go over 6%.
I think it's also important to look at like what kind of stories are represented within that 6%, right? I think because of the nature of the gatekeeping in publishing, it's like we're making good progress, but like I think there's still a lot of breadth to go as far as like what kind of Asian American stories are out there. That's what I like to see a lot of. Now I feel like we've knocked down the door, and now we get to like kind of settle in and like figure out, get more comfortable with the kinds of stories that and get a little more nuanced.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a lot of Asian American authors, but there are not that many Asian American editors and publishers, so we need diverse representation in the other side, of the publishing too.
I suck at math and my kids say infinity. I suck at math and my kids say we need infinity numbers. And I tend to agree.
I think the problem with that, and the reason the question is even controversial, is then you're taking up somebody else. Somebody else will feel, they're taking up a space that could have been given to me. So, I mean, the nature of it is very competitive, and I'm a very competitive person, and I was compulsively and pathologically competitive when I was a kid, and I try to kind of tamp that down as a grown-up. But so I am a striver, and I don't think anyone should ever be satisfied. But at the same time, I think the larger picture is that everybody out there wants representation and balance. And but I think what someone said about the editors, that's really important as well. Like the gatekeeper is a word that comes into my mind all the time when I think about publishing, because I feel like there are gatekeepers, and we need to, they need, and it's always going to be the case, but they need to be chosen maybe more wisely or something.
Right. And I think, to Min's point too about what's in the 6%, like we're not only writing representation novels, like we're writing stories that we hope will have universal appeal and will be relevant to many different types of people.
Okay, that leads me to our final rapid round, right? So aside from representation, one word or two words, what do you want your reader to take away from your book? That was emailed to everybody, so you should have this question answered already, okay? So I'm going to start by calling on the last person that introduced yourself. So Kalia.
Magical love.
Great. Abigail.
To be seen.
Christina.
Pure fun, enjoyment.
Cynthia.
I always think I want them to get out of it whatever they need to get out of it. I almost feel like I don't even have standing once I've written the book to say what they should get out of it.
Perfect. Minh?
The power of art and community.
Robin?
Empathy.
And thank you so much. And I want my students, I want to have the last word, to see themselves, especially Asian American students, not as victims, not as the ones being oppressed only, not as somebody who is just knowing trauma, but have agency And by reading all your books, I think they are going to have the opportunity to have agency, to have fun, to have art, to have magic, to have whatever they need from the book. So thank you all so much for sharing your talent and your thoughts and yourselves with us today. So hope to see a lot of you in other opportunities. I feel so blessed. Thank you all so much
You all are so
for participating.
Roxanne.